Thank everyone for being here tonight. What a thrill for me looking out here at the River Thames, and to be literally on the side of the Houses of Parliament is a great privilege for me. Had a marvelous tour this morning. I'd never been inside Parliament before this morning, just to see the chambers. And we in America love watching the Prime Minister's questions. And we love the lady, I heard she's now in the House of Lords, who used to be the Speaker, and would say, order, when things were getting a little out of control. But we love that. I love seeing those places.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. In this clip, Bishop Barron is giving a just stunning speech on the Sermon on the Mount to Parliament. That is the British version of the Congress that we have here in the United States. This is an amazing speech. You don't want to miss it. Check this out.
Listen, I know when people like me come to places like this, we often talk about church-state relations or about religious liberty or maybe even the Christian foundations of democracy, et cetera. Those are all important themes, and I've written and spoken about them. But I thought I wanted to talk about something in a way simpler and more profound. And here's the first thing I want you to think about. The very presence of the church, the endurance of the church for the past 2,000 years is worth thinking about. The church that has existed in the context of ancient empires and medieval monarchies and modern nation states and totalitarian systems, sometimes extolled, very often persecuted, and yet is still here, I think is deeply odd, it's deeply strange and worth reflecting on. It's practically an empirical verification of Jesus' prediction that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. So what I want to think about and reflect on with you is, what is it that has made the church, despite its failures, and of course we know them all, and the great sins that have happened individually, collectively, and institutionally, granting all of that, what is it nevertheless that has made Christianity so consistently, to the present day, a powerful cultural and social force? That's what I want to talk about. I want to begin in a perhaps a counterintuitive way with a young Hindu law student who arrived here in London in 1888 to commence his studies. He was at first so shy and so unsure of his English that he didn't want to venture outside his room. I'm talking, of course, about Mohandas Gandhi. Eventually he overcame his shyness, and he fell in with a group of very devout Christians who challenged him to read the Bible. And of course, Gandhi was insatiably curious, so he started to read the scriptures. Like a lot of first-time readers of the Bible, he had a very difficult time with the Old Testament. But the New Testament electrified him, especially chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. So Gandhi reads about enemy love. He reads about the power of nonviolence. And he comes back to his Christian friends, filled with excitement at what he discovered. And his Christian friends smiled at him rather condescendingly and said, well, yeah, those are nice ideals, and maybe a handful of saints live that way, but we really don't, take it that seriously. See, but sometimes you need an outsider to read our text with fresh eyes. And I think Gandhi brought that freshness to it, and he realized these were not just pious ideals. In fact, these were principles that could transform lives individually and transform society. He had discovered, if I can borrow Peter Morin's phrase, some of the dynamite of the church. Now, I'm going to interrupt myself to say, I know it's a little dicey for a Catholic to be talking in Parliament about dynamite. I understand that. But Peter Morin, the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, said, we've taken the dynamite of the church, dunamis, right, the power of the church. We placed it in hermetically sealed containers and have sat on the lid. It's time to blow up some of the dynamite of the church. And of course, Morin, the great apostle of nonviolence, meant we need to unleash the power of the gospel. And I think Gandhi, in his own way, stumbled upon some of it. And then how wonderful that Gandhi becomes, and his social action becomes, what we call today a meme. So Archbishop Tutu in South Africa, Martin Luther King in my country, John Paul II in Poland, all imitated the nonviolence that Gandhi learned from chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew. So I want to talk about this dunamis, this power. The Sermon on the Mount is not an ordinary ethic. If you line up the ethics of Plato and the ethics of Aristotle and the ethics of Cicero and the ethics of Kant and the ethics of, Peter Singer, wherever it is, And then he said, well, there's the ethics of Jesus. That's the wrong way to think about it, as though it's one philosophical proposal among many. The Sermon on the Mount is a vision of life that follows from the metaphysics I've just been describing. If you accept that vision of reality, then you will live in a particular way. Your life will look like something. It'll look like the Sermon on the Mount. If you try to put that into ordinary ethical categories, it won't make a lick of sense. In fact, I don't know any philosopher who sounds like the Sermon on the Mount. There's good reason for that, because it's now the Logos of God telling us how to live in accordance with this deep metaphysics. So let me look at a couple of features of the Sermon on the Mount. I'm going to get to the dynamite that Gandhi saw. But let's begin with the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are about right praise, I think. There are 4 negative Beatitudes and 4 positive. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What does that mean? I would render it this way, because makarios is the Greek there, and blessed, people say, are happy. Some of you suggest lucky might be a translation of makarios. How fortunate you are. If you're poor in spirit, how lucky you are, how fortunate you are, how right-minded you are. If you do not worship material things, you don't worship the goods of the world. Now, again, we all know this, but Christianity is not a puritanical system. It's not a Platonic system. It's not a dualist system. God makes everything, and it's good, and the ensemble is very good. We're non-dualist. We don't marginalize or demonize the things of this world. However, we can't worship them. They can't become the summum bonum. Now, you think that's an abstraction. Well, look around. It happens all the time. That people make of the goods of the world, whether it's material things, it's the money that can buy material things. That becomes the organizing principle of my life. I start to worship those things. Now I will get off kilter on the inside of my life, and I will radiate disharmony and unhappiness around me. Therefore, how blessed you are if you're detached from material things. You're not going to worship them. So Augustine again told us the fundamental problem is always mistaking a creature for the creator. That's always the fundamental problem. If I'm unhappy, my life is disordered. That's why. I've taken some worldly good and made it the summum bonum. You can't do that. So you're lucky, makarios, if you're detached from it. Secondly, this is the second of the negative Beatitudes. Blessed are they who mourn. I'd read it this way. How fortunate you are, how lucky you are, if you're not addicted to psychological good feeling. You don't worship your psychological contentment. Nothing wrong with psychological contentment. I'm all in favor of it. If you can get it, that's great. I prefer it to the alternative, right? But I mustn't worship it. I cannot make it the summum bonum of my life. You know, being in the Westminster Hall earlier today and standing where one of my great heroes, Thomas More, stood on trial, if Thomas More had believed that his psychological well-being was the summum bonum, he never would have come to that point, right? And More's a good example because, you know, this great humanist and a man of wit and humor and friendship, he loved the things of this world. He loved psychological well-being, but he didn't worship it. He didn't think it was the summum bonum. How lucky you are, therefore, if you mourn. Third of the negative Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek. Again, what a peculiar thing to say. I mean, from Aristotle to the 21st century, name another philosopher who would say there is a key to happiness is to be meek. No, we tend to extol power. And again, power is not bad in itself. God's described as powerful, right? Political power, cultural power, nothing wrong with them in themselves. But we can't worship them. And again, you think that's an abstraction. Well, I mean, people in this room especially should know better, right? That's one of the great temptations. Do you remember, I always find in the great Lord of the Rings stories that one of the most frightening scenes, it's not the orcs and all the battles and all that. It was a scene when Gandalf, right, the great Gandalf, the great wise and good wizard, looks at as I'm wearing the ring, looks at the ring of power, and you can tell for a moment that even the great Gandalf is beguiled by the ring. He wants it, you know? And what would have happened if he had given in to the seduction of power? If he had worshipped power? The havoc that would have caused inside him and in the world around him. How lucky you are, therefore, if you're meek. You don't worship power or make it your summum bonum. Again, look at Moore, one of the most powerful people in his time, culturally and politically. He didn't eschew power, didn't demonize it, but he didn't worship it. If he did, he wouldn't have come to Westminster Hall on trial. And then finally, blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. You know, in some ways, friends, this might be the most seductive of them all. So there's wealth and there's pleasure and there's power. But the last one that we tend to worship in the place of God is honor. Some people can live without, wealth, pleasure, and power, but by God, they want honor, to be respected, to have titles, to be thought highly of. Some people will do anything to procure honor. They'll do anything to avoid losing honor. Honor is good in itself. Aquinas calls it the flag of virtue. It's pretty good, isn't it? We honor people that we think, oh, that's a person of virtue. Let me put a flag on him or her. Let me give them a title. But if you fall in love with the flag and the title in themselves, you start to worship it. And now your life gets off kilter. So don't worship these four things. Worship God alone. Now, listen to the four, I'll call them the positive beatitudes. How blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's a beautiful way to put it, of course. What's the one thing you should worship? The will of God. To be righteous. To want what God wants. How happy you are if that's the summum bonum of your life. Above wealth, pleasure, honor, and power. That you want what God wants. You want the righteousness of God. That's what brought Moore to the culmination of his life, wasn't it? That he loved righteousness. Relatedly, how blessed are the single-hearted, or the pure of heart, some translations have it. Kierkegaard said the saint is someone whose life's about one thing. It's a lovely definition, right? Doesn't mean that the saint lives this monotonous life. Look at Moore. I mean, a life like your own, like many in this room. A man of affairs and politics and diplomacy and so on. His life was anything but monotonous. But yet it was about one thing. He didn't worship anything else except the will of God. He was single-hearted. How blessed are the merciful. Now here's the Augustinian principle, isn't it? You become what you worship. If you worship the gods of Rome, you'll start looking like them. If you worship the God who is love, you will look like mercy. And how wonderful, the King James renders hesed from the Old Testament. Beautiful Hebrew term. As tender mercy. That's who God is. That's who God is. And in that tender mercy, he gave rise to the world. In that tender mercy, he calls us to worship him, to lead a chorus of praise on behalf of the whole world. Therefore, when you worship God, you become yourself merciful, full of love. And then the last one, and this brings me back to Gandhi and his followers. How blessed are the peacemakers. How do we make peace? By becoming peaceful in ourselves. I've had the privilege in my life of knowing, I think, a few real saints. And that's the mark, isn't it? There's a peacefulness because they're ordered. They're like the harmony of a rose window, all the elements that center around the one place. They're grounded, they're anchored. And peaceful people tend to radiate peace outward. They're peacemakers. Just revisit for a second the text that Gandhi found so compelling. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn and give him the other. Well, I love the interpretation that specifies this in terms of the culture of Jesus' time. You would never have used your left hand in any kind of social interaction that was considered unclean. So if you strike someone on the right cheek, that means you've hit them like this. You've hit them with the back of your hand. And that was a sign of contempt. The way you treat an inferior or a slave. So what does Jesus say? He doesn't say, run away or acquiesce. What he says is, stand your ground and turn the other cheek. I think, what does that accomplish? It mirrors the injustice and violence of your aggressor back to him. It's not acquiescence or passivity. Gandhi got that, didn't he? It's not passivity. It's standing your ground and trying to lure that aggressor back into a right vision of things. I apologize in advance if you've heard this. I've told this story a number of times before, but it's such a beautiful exemplification of the point. It has to do with Bishop Tutu, but when he was a young man, and he was on this sidewalk over a muddy street in Johannesburg, and he's moving along, comes to a narrow place, and there was a white man who was very racist who met him, and he said, "Get off the sidewalk. I don't make way for gorillas." And so Tutu got off the sidewalk, and he gestured very broadly and said, "I do." And see, what I like about that story is it exemplifies this principle rather well. Tutu didn't fight back, so, fighting fire with fire, which doesn't accomplish very much. But he didn't run. He didn't run or passively acquiesce, but rather in this provocative way, he mirrored back to the aggressive person his aggression, trying thereby to lure him into a different vision of things. It struck me when I arrived here a couple days ago, just with jet lag and all that. I wandered down to the area around Westminster Abbey, and I saw, of course, the statue of Gandhi out there. And I thought of that young man in 1888 who, was shyly making his way to British society. And then, of course, the cross on the facade of the Abbey, right in the middle, is Martin Luther King. And King learned that from Gandhi. He learned the power of this and made it happen in my own country in a remarkable way. I mentioned, too, John Paul II, and we shouldn't overlook that. John Paul II, who effected this massive social change, first in Poland, then throughout the Soviet Empire. Look, when I was a kid in the 1970s, if you had told me the Soviet Empire would collapse with nearly a shot being fired and that a main actor was the Pope of Rome, I would have thought you were living in a fantasy book. But by God, it happened, right? By God, it happened. The dunamis, the power, the dynamite of the church that's in the Sermon on the Mount, which is reflective of the metaphysics of creation. See, when you start acting in line with the deepest rhythm of reality, you're going to unleash power.
I hope you really enjoyed that clip of Bishop Barron's stunning speech that he gave to the British Parliament. So the majority of the time, he's reflecting on the Sermon on the Mount, and he does so from a apologetic standpoint, is how I would frame it, in the sense he's telling the story about Gandhi. He's telling how this Sermon on the Mount really resonated with him, and if it resonated with him, I think the conclusion would be that it can resonate with lots of people. It truly is the dunamis, or the dynamite, of the Christian faith, that there is this otherworldly kingdom that manifests itself, and it looks like humble and radical devotion to God, right worship ordered back to God. And it looks like these principles, these platitudes that are found within the beatitudes that Jesus, of course, is giving on the Sermon on the Mount. So to walk in conjunction with what Bishop Barron is saying here, I thought it would be helpful to actually read and meditate a little bit on what the Sermon on the Mount is actually talking about. And so I just wanted to read it here. So it's found in chapter 5. And of course, Bishop Barron mentioned that Gandhi was really captivated by verses 4, 5, and 6. So I guess we could go back here to chapter 4. And of course, it's the temptation of Jesus. This is the beginning and the initiation of his ministry. And one of the things that always sticks out to me with the temptation of Jesus is that when he is confronted with the devil, by the devil, not with the devil, but by the devil in the wilderness to be tempted, he responds with scripture. No, the scriptures say, the scriptures say, the scriptures say. There is great power against the devil in knowing what the scriptures say and what God has revealed in scripture. So, of course, he begins his ministry then, and we get to chapter 5, and Jesus gives a Sermon on the Mount. One of the things that I noticed in just reflecting upon what Bishop Barron was saying is that this sermon was given to his disciples. So there is a part of the Sermon on the Mount, I think, of what Bishop Barron is saying that resonates with people, but it's also important to remember that in context, Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount to his disciples. And another thing is that it happened on the mountainside. So this didn't happen in Jerusalem. This didn't happen with the aristocratic class either, with Parliament or a Congress, but really with the farmers, the normal people, I guess we could say, who were actually following Jesus, the Galileans. These were not the aristocratic city folk; they were the country folk. And since they were, I think that sheds a light on who Jesus was reaching, and also kind of the crowd that would have been hearing what he is saying, what he was saying in the Beatitudes. So let's just read them. The Beatitudes. And another thing that's important to mention too is that this is just like the opening lines of Jesus's sermon. It seemed it probably went on for a very long time, because in chapters 5 and 6 you see all sorts of different teachings that Jesus kind of explained during this time. But these are the Beatitudes. And I'm reading from a paraphrase translation. If it's not the one that you like, I'm sorry. It's just the one that I think is helpful for people to see kind of the idea behind what's being conveyed here. So God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. God blesses those who work for peace. And Bishop Barron mentioned this, didn't he, at the end? God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. But notice this as well. Verses 11 and 12. God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you are my followers. Be about it. Be very glad, for great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. So the Beatitudes is really just kind of this counterintuitive kingdom that Jesus Christ is bringing, and it's for a specific people, his disciples. This is what you should expect if you are a disciple, if you are a follower of Christ. God blesses, or in other translations, it literally is, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek. The reality is that God is blessing. God is giving a provision. Now, what you would think of is oh, well, that means material possession, material wealth. No, on the contrary, what it means is that there is a certain way to live in this world that doesn't look like worldly power. And I think this is what Bishop Barron is getting at. It doesn't look like worldly power. It looks like worldly weakness. But in true worldly weakness that is in full submission to God, there is dynamis, there is power. And I think that's the entire point of what Bishop Barron is getting at. So there's just a few things that I think is important to remember about the context, because I think the context of the passage can be lost in these types of settings. The Sermon on the Mount was for his disciples, those that were following Jesus. And there was great blessing. And this blessing doesn't come from our own merit, but it really comes from God's grace. It comes from God. It's God who's giving the blessing to these certain types of people, the poor, those who are mourning, those who are humble and hunger and thirst for justice and are merciful and have a heart that's pure and work for peace. And these are the types of people that God blesses. So the question becomes, are we being that type of people? And of course, I think politicians need to hear that, and peasants, all of us, we all need to hear the reality that God is going to bless and grace those who humble themselves in this life, who seek peace, who have pure hearts and motives, who thirst and hunger for justice. This is the type of people that we need, and we need people to live into these realities because it's the foundation. It's the foundational reality, as Bishop Barron is talking about as well. All right, that's all I have for this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Remember that Christianity is Christ. Without Christ, there is no Christianity. See you in the next one. Peace.